Workaholics, so welcome back to another video. Today I am bringing you some more batch standalone reviews. I started doing these batch standalone reviews because I always like having somewhere to reference back to my thoughts on a particular book. And with series, it was really easy. I could just say, hey, I'm going to mention this series. If you want to know more thoughts on it, here's a video. But I didn't really have that with my standalones. And that was starting to really bother me because obviously with the standalones, then I'd have to go through all of my past wrap-ups to see if I could find it, or a past vlog. It just seemed like a lot of work. So instead, I have decided that I am going to compile 5 different standalones and then talk about them in a review form. So if there are any that you're interested in, they will simply be linked in the description box so you can jump around to see which books you want to hear me talk about. Obviously, at the moment, because I have my entire back catalogue worth of standalones to talk about, I am doing them by theme because I couldn't remember what order I read them in and I couldn't be bothered to keep scrolling through Goodreads. The hope is that eventually I will just catch up with my reading and then I will be able to simply do the next 5. Every time I read 5 standalones, I can do a review. But until that day, we are on themed ones. The theme for this one is going to be Whimsical. I've already done one of these, so this is Whimsical Part 2, and I have again 5 whimsical fantasy standalones to talk about today. The first one I'm going to talk about is Monster Midwife by Lumen Reese. This one is the very first Lumen Reese book that I read, and in it we are following someone who is literally a monster midwife. She was training to be a midwife when she was captured by the Fae, and now she helps the Fae give birth. She has a very good understanding over the years of how the Fae body works to maximize the probability of the mother and the child surviving, making her very invaluable to this kingdom. She is kept well, but is still essentially a slave to the Fae, and it is her story on how she eventually comes into her own and begins to advocate for herself and stand up for herself. It's a very short book. It was very easy to get through. I loved the depictions of Fae in this story. I just think that it captures the beauty and the awe, but also the malevolence that comes with the Fae. I think is a lot of the time we'll either go with the romantic side or we go with the horror side. This one had a beautiful balance of, I understand the draw of the Fae and the awe of the Fae, but at the same time there's this underlayer of horror, of fear that they evoke from you, and it was such a good balance. Had me definitely reading all of the other Lumen Reeses since, just because of how engrossed I was in this one. I will say that the prose in this one is less whimsical and flowery than you would expect from like a literary fantasy, but it's definitely more ethereal than you get with the more romantic Fae stories. So while there is a romance in here, it's definitely not like a Fae romance story and does lean more into the fairy tale-esque nature of the telling. So if you're going into this and you're like, oh, I want another Fae romance, I'll pick this one up, that's not really the vibe. And while there is a romance in it, it's definitely not a central point. So do bear that in mind, but I just thought this was a stunning story. I had a great time with it, and while the pacing got a little bit odd in the third quarter for a little bit there, it definitely paid off, so it was worth it. But at the time I didn't know that, so now you know, in case you're going in, the funky little pacing bit that happens near the end, it is worth it in my opinion. The next one I'm going to talk about is The Winter Garden by Alexandra Bell. This was one of my favorite books the year that I read it. It's very much in a similar vein to The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern, and this one is the story of Beatrice, who when her mother dies, her father becomes very distant and very cold, and she kind of blames herself because she didn't go and say goodbye to her mother. And while her mother was sick, this magical garden kept appearing in her garden and she would go visit it, and ever since then, ever since her mother died, the garden has never returned and she has spent the rest of her life searching for it. We're also following her best friend, who is the daughter of an American socialite, but she's also an inventor, and she creates mechanical animals and they kind of come to life. It was amazing. Just so much of this was beautiful. Before we go any further with this, content warnings. Obviously death of a parent, that's literally mentioned in the story, but domestic violence is prevalent and it is there for a decent chunk. There is a resolution to it. So if you are someone who wants the catharsis from that, I think you'd like this. But if you are someone who cannot handle on-page depictions, I genuinely think you should not read this because it's prevalent. on page for a while. We also have a very interesting romance happening. We also have our protagonist, Beatrice, is very much in the same ilk as maybe Lady Trent. She's someone who has spent a lot of time researching. She's someone who wants to travel to go find this circus. Someone who, through circumstances, has actually come into some money and is going to use that to push forward their own aspirations instead of societal expectations. And I really love that. We're also following, as I said, Rosa, who has gone from believing that because she is from new money, she needs to marry into royalty to solidify that power, only to know that she actually has had it all along because she's an inventor. Overall, I really, really did appreciate this book, and content warnings, as I said, but I think that they are tackled and handled, and there are very interesting conversations to be had. So while I love this book, I do think you should proceed with caution. The next one I'm going to talk about is When Women Were Dragons by Kelly Barnhill. This one is a women's rage story. In this story, we are following a young woman who, in her childhood, there was what was called the flight or the ascent. And basically, post-war England, a load of women suddenly turned into dragons and flew away. Amongst them was her aunt, who she was very close with, someone who had helped raise her when her mother was sick, someone who had taught her about women's strength. We're following this young woman later on as she's an adult and how she comes to terms with the fact that her aunt became one of these dragons and how women's rage functions. This book is fantasy feminism. It is literally feminism 101. It is there to try and start a conversation about feminism. It is not as inclusive as I would have liked it to have been. There are very few conversations around especially trans women, which whenever you are talking about something that's on the verge of being gender essentialist, like women being the only ones that have the ability to turn into dragons, I think it is an important thing to have a little bit more of a conversation around than we did. We also have less depictions of women of colour, and again, anything that is to do with women's rage, I genuinely do prefer if they are more inclusive. I don't think that it's as unintersectional as some people believe it to be, because there are conversations around women of colour and around trans people and lesbians, etc. I just think that it's centered more on white women, and I can understand how that would be an issue in and of its own right. So while I did enjoy this book, I do understand that it is very, if you're actually using it as a conversation point for feminism, it is very, very basic. If you're just wanting a fun fantasy read that happens to have some decent feminism messaging in there, then this is a good time. And that's what I went into it reading. I went to read a book that happened to have a bit of women's rage in it, and that's fine. But if you're wanting this to have any kind of genuine conversation about feminism, it's not really gonna give you much that you don't already know. So as a story, I found it enjoyable. I really did like our protagonist. I think that in stories like this, a lot of the time the protagonists kind of get washed into the messaging. I did feel like she was quite an autonomous character. I really loved the depiction of the aunt that we got at the beginning as well. I think the relationship that she has with her sister is also an interesting topic, and I think that the way that she begins to view the world throughout this story was really well handled. I just don't think that it covers much ground if you're looking for it to be a feminist novel as opposed to just a fantasy book that happens to have some feminism in it. So it depends on the approach in which you go into the book, I think. I think when it gets advertised as this super feminist book by a load of reviewers, like, this is the best feminist fantasy I've read, if you're going into it with those expectations, then I don't think that it's very intersectional. I don't think it's very diverse. If you're looking just for a piece of fantasy that happens to have some feminism in it, then you will probably have a good time. So if you go in with the right mindset, I think it'll be a really good book. The next one I'm going to talk about is The Mermaid Mrs Hancock by Imogen Hermes Goer. This one is basically historical fiction with one magical component, which is the mermaid. So in this story, we are following Jonah Hancock, who is a merchant. He owns multiple merchant ships. And one day he wakes up to one of his captains knocking on his door and saying that he has sold Jonah's ship in exchange for the body of a mermaid. So now Jonah has been thrust into the limelight. All of high society is suddenly really interested in this previously uninteresting merchant. It is how he begins to navigate high society. On the other end of that, we have Angelica Neal, who is a social climber. Basically, she is a woman who of that time did not have much standing, so she wanted to marry upwards. And with Jonah being someone who is less experienced in high society, he seems like a good target for her to try and marry because he won't think less of her like a lot of high society will. And it's a relationship between the two. It's the ethics around owning the body of a mermaid and also around women's lack of rights, and therefore the fact that, for example, you have Angelica being looked down on for literally doing the only thing women could do to further themselves in society at this time. So for the most part, I enjoyed it. I think the conversations were done well. I don't think there were anything new. I don't think there were anything that we haven't seen several times in historical fiction before. The Mermaid added an interesting twist to it, but I am excited to read more from this author at some point, but I don't feel strongly about this book either which way. It was well written. It's a decent historical fiction. That's about it. It's been a little while since I've read this. I don't have very many memories of it. I don't have any connection to any of the characters. I had to look on the back of the book to remember the characters' names. So it's not one I feel strongly about, but one that I appreciated when I read. And the last one, arguably the weirdest one on here, is The Crash of Hennington by Patrick Ness. Patrick Ness is actually one of my all-time favourite YA authors. Both the Chaos Walking trilogy and a few of his standalones, for example, Burn, More Than This, Release, The Rest of Us Just Live Here. All of those I love. All of them 5 stars. Absolutely love his books. This was his debut novel, and it is one of only 2 books that he's written so far for adults. And this is a weird book. I can't even really say that this is fantasy. It's just odd, but it's speculative enough that it fits in here. And we have, yes, The Crash of Hennington. We have this group of people who are living in this town that's called Hennington. And Hennington is quite bizarre because it has an area that is a natural habitat for rhinos. We have the rhinos that live outside of Hennington and the way that impacts the inhabitants. And it's like a Patrick Ness style, quirky, speculative, Desperate Housewives. Like, you're just seeing the lives of different people in this town and the way that they interconnect. And it's really weird. It is actually one of the first depictions I'd ever read of polyamory. And it's an interesting version of polyamory because it's a married couple who like to have extra company in the bedroom. So I really did like that because it was a really healthy relationship between the two. It wasn't depicted as, look, they can't even get it on without another person. It was, look, this is how they work together to contribute to their relationship, to each other's pleasure, etc., which I did really appreciate. But this is the weakest Patrick Ness novel that I've read. Granted, again, it is his debut. There was just so much in here that I was like, huh? It got a bit too, not even weird in like a fun, quirky way. Just, I don't know why I'm reading this sometimes, which was a shame. It's still so well written and still so innovative that it did get a 3-star, but there were so many things in there that I'm like, I don't really understand why I'm reading this. And that was such a strange experience of reading a book that I'm kind of enjoying, but I also don't know why I'm enjoying it. I don't know why I'm reading it. If I put it down and come back 3 months later, will it make any difference? Probably not, because the last chapter I already am confused about. So it was an odd experience, but it was an interesting insight into people's minds. That's what he does a lot. He's very good at talking about societal impact, about individual impact, interpersonal relationships, the way that we fit in within this world. And all of that was done in a really interesting way, and I really did appreciate it. So an interesting book. I'm not sure how much I can recommend it, but if you want something really bizarre, but you like reading contemporary, you might enjoy this. It's just strange. And there you have it. Those are the 5 reviews that I have for you today. As I said, the timestamps are in the description box in case you want to go check out one of the reviews specifically, again, for whatever purpose. And that is all from me for today. So let me know if you've read any of these books and your thoughts on it, or if based on my liking of these books you have any recommendations. Please let me know down below, and I'll hopefully catch you in another video soon. Bye!